I really love the B-29 airplane. I always have, and I always will. I love the look of it. I love the sound of the four engines when they're running, 2,200 horsepower each. It's a great sound, and the airplane, after all, brought me through World War II virtually without a scratch, and I'm forever grateful for that. I enlisted when I was 17 and a half. My dad didn't want me to be drafted, so he signed for me with my mother, and I got into the Cadet Corps, and I went through basic training and all the stuff that leads up to primary training. Got into primary training at George Field in Lawrenceville, Illinois. And as we finished primary training and we were going on to basic training, they decided that they were making airplanes less frequently than they were making pilots. So they cut our whole class. They washed our whole class out, and we got the opportunity to go to B-29 bombardier, navigator, or engineer flight school, flight engineer school. So when that happened, I chose to be a flight engineer, and was sent to Amarillo Army Air Base in the panhandle of Texas. And I trained to be a flight engineer there for several months. Then from there, we went to Kearney, Nebraska, where we met up with the remainder of our crew. They made up a crew there, and we started training on the B-29 for 2 or 3 weeks before we started to take off for the Marianas. So we left Nebraska. We flew to Travis Air Force Base near San Francisco, and then we flew from there to Honolulu, Hawaii, and from there to Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, and from there to Saipan, where we were ultimately stationed. At the time, let's see, I would have been 18 years old, because I became 19 on the 17th of October of 1944. So I was flying missions before my 19th birthday.
What rank were you?
I was a second lieutenant. And sometimes that elicits a little problem, because most of the flight engineers were enlisted men. And they resented having these young kids come there with the gold bars. But when they learned what we had gone through and were inadvertently washed out of flight school, they sort of pulled back and accepted the situation. When they decided that they were going to wash our class out through no fault of our own, and give us a chance to be a flight engineer, navigator, or bombardier on the B-29, I was very, very disappointed. All of us were disappointed, because we were set on being hot fighter pilots, you know, and it was being taken away from us. So, yes, we were a little angry and upset about it, but you're in the service, you do what you're told, and we accepted it. My first mission would have been about the third week in October of 1944, because my fourth mission was in the middle of November, and that's the one where we had to ditch the airplane on our return, which is another story. Our first mission, we were frightened. We were maybe not frightened so much as just anticipating what might happen. We were confident in what we were doing. We knew what we what our jobs were, and we knew that we could do them well. But we did have an airplane that was giving us a little trouble with the engines. They often were hot and had to be shut down because of that. So there was some trepidation there in terms of the mechanics of the airplane. And in addition to that, it was our first time to be in a combat situation, and we really didn't know what to expect. We heard horror stories from a lot of people, and who should probably not have passed them on, but they did. And so we were all young. I was the youngest on the airplane. Our airplane commander was going just 24 years old, going on 25. And even the enlisted men were young people. I did have, the navigator was a close friend because he had gone through flight school at the same time that I did. His name was Bobby Knight, and his name began with a K, and as you know in the military, K's, L's, and M's, would tend to get the same assignments. And so Bobby Knight became a navigator, and strangely enough, when we crewed up at Kearney, Nebraska, Bobby Knight was our navigator. So we did have a kinship there that we could lean on a little bit. But we were scared. Yeah, we were scared. On the day of a typical mission, you get up at about 6 o'clock in the morning. This is for a day mission. You get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, you shower, shave, and whatever, and then go to mess, have a breakfast, and then come back and get to work on the airplane, making certain that everything was operating on the airplane correctly. And when it was, then you went to the briefing. At the briefing, you were told which direction you were going to fly, what altitude you were going to fly, what you were going to do when you get there. You were given every detail of the mission. All you had to do was execute it. And so the planning of all that was done by the operations officers, and they did it very well. By the time we came out of that briefing, we knew exactly what we were going to be up against.
And what was that?
Well, we in a daytime mission, you could fly, you take off, you start your engines, you taxi out of the revetment, you go to the active runway, and you start your takeoff run. You make your run, you get off, hopefully off the ground, and you climb to 5,000 feet. And at 5,000 feet, you send the bombardier back to arm the bombs. And then you turn north, and you follow your prescribed altitude and direction. And as you approach Iwo Jima, the fighters come up to meet you. And we have no fighters of our own because we don't have bases that are close enough for the short range that fighters have. So until Iwo Jima was taken back by our Marines in March of 1945, we didn't have any aircraft cover at all. So we flew the entire mission on our own and dropped our bombs and came home, hopefully. Now, after March of 1945, our friendly little P-51s would come up and take us all the way in. But we, in return, were their navigators to get them back home, because they were not very good navigators over water.
What was the temperature like, and what was it like crawling in the airplane when it was full coverage of sun? It must have been an oven.
Absolutely. The temperature in the airplane when you got in, because of the sun driving down on it all the time, well, when it wasn't raining, so when the sun was out, it beat on the airplane. You had to get into it. So you opened up the hatches, Okay, the minute you get in here, both windows were opened. Okay, this was left open. All right, and we get the air flowing through the airplane, and then gradually we could get the temperature down. We close her up, and we get the temperature down to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what we flew at most of the time. We kept it at 65 to keep guys awake, I guess. It had to be cool. So we kept it at 65 degrees, and we pressurized the cabin to about 6,500 feet. And so it was a very, very comfortable airplane to ride in.
And you were the one that adjusted the temperature, is that right?
Yes. I had charge of all the systems on the aircraft except the armament. I had nothing to do with the armament. The armorers took care of all that, even the electrical systems that operated the turrets and so forth. That was not in my province at all. I had most of the mechanical things, and I could control the cabin temperature and the pressurization and all of these things. As a matter of fact, as flight engineer, I operated all of the engine controls except the throttles that belonged to the captain, But he would ask me for certain power settings for takeoff. Then he would ask me for climb power settings. Then he would call and ask me for cruise when he was ready. And I would give him all those things. So.
When you were starting the engines, you worked with the tail gunner who started the auxiliary power unit, and you worked as a team to get those.
Exactly. You had to have the generator from the auxiliary power unit online so that you could turn the engines over. Yes. Typical night mission would start at, depending on where you were going, would start anywhere from 8 till 10 o'clock at night. And you do the same kind of preparation, although you've got all day long to wait. And so you do a lot of napping and relaxation and so forth, getting ready for a long trip. But you would, the same way, we would get in our airplanes and take off every 90 seconds and turn north and go on the exact routes that were briefed for us. And it was dark. It would become dark very soon, and the navigator was the one that was in trouble there, and we would do our best to ward off any competition that we might have. Sometimes we had it, sometimes we did not. The Japanese did not like to fly at night, so night missions were a little safer from that standpoint. But we still had the everlasting anti-aircraft fire at the other end when we tried to go in on the target. Yes, the sights and sounds of an attack have to be experienced to really understand it. Everybody's yelling. Everybody is pointing out bogeys. We got one coming in from 9 o'clock. We got another one coming in from 12. Then the tail gunner would say, we got one coming on our 6. And the central fire control officer is activating the port gun or the starboard guns. He's firing himself. And it's chaos. If you've ever heard 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in a turret, firing at the same time, you know there's chaos. And so when you were in the battle, there was a lot of noise going on in the airplane as well, as over the intercom and so forth. The pilot, of course, is trying to close formation with everybody else so that we can tighten up and have a good crossfire situation so that the fighters can only attack from the perimeters. They can't go through us because we'll get them for sure if they go through us. Yeah. So that's the kind of situation. It didn't always happen. We had milk runs, we had times when we were flying shorter missions where we never encountered anything except always anti-aircraft fire, always. And devastating. They were very good people with anti-aircraft fire, except in one instance. They had a little trouble seeing how high, what altitude we were. And of course that's important because the anti-aircraft fire has explosive cartridges, and so what you want to do is you want to get the correct altitude of the airplanes as well, so that the fragments from the shells will damage the airplanes. Our aircraft was hit many times by fighter bullets, so those are patchable. They didn't do much in terms of decompressing the airplane or anything like that. But one time we did have pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire, and the anti-aircraft fire unfortunately came right up through my feet and hit me in the ankle. And with that little bitty wound, I got a Purple Heart. But that did quite a bit of damage, and we did a good deal of patching on that airplane from that. Fortunately, it didn't hit any wiring or tubing or anything of that nature.
Did you fly both kinds of bombing raids? In other words, the higher altitude hitting aircraft factories with 500-pound bombs, for instance, and then also the low altitude ones with incendiaries. Did you fly both times? We
flew both kinds of missions. The so-called strategic bombing that was high altitude and aimed at an engine plant or an aircraft factory or something like that. And that was early in the game. We did that all the time when we first started to fly until March of 1945. In March of 1945, they got sick and tired of us being ineffective doing that for two reasons, largely. The first reason being that the weather was always awful, winds were high, and the bomb site simply wasn't capable of the high winds. Okay, so that was one reason we were ineffective with fragmentation bombs. The other reason that we were not effective was that very soon the Japanese figured out that we could pick out a factory and knock it out. So what they did was they broke down their assembly lines into pieces and brought them into cottage factories. So for two reasons, they did that too for two reasons. One was to hide them from us, and also to put in the effect of collateral damage to the civilians and so forth, which they thought the Americans were too weak to overcome. So they felt that we would not bomb as effectively if they put them in homes. I've got to say that that did not keep us from doing that.
Then with the...
Now, in March, to finish the question, in March, the commander of the 20th Air Force decided to call in Kurt LeMay from Europe and bring him to find out why we were not being effective in bombing. And Kurt LeMay got into one of our airplanes and accompanied us on a mission. He wanted to see for himself firsthand. So he did. He accompanied us on this mission, which was a minimal success. And when we got back, he went into a meeting and he said, I'm paraphrasing now, gentlemen, from now on, the fragmentation bombs are out, high altitude bombing is out. You will now bomb from 12,000 feet or below, and we will fill the airplane with incendiary and burn them out. And that's what we did from then on to the end of the war.
I've heard stories that they started taking all the turrets, all the guns out of the B-29s except the tail gun when they started doing that low altitude incendiary. Did they do that to your airplane?
They did not do it to our airplane. They may have done that to airplanes from Guam or, someplace south of us, Rota or Guam. I think from Saipan and Tinian, they kept us armed because we could carry the weight and we could take the same amount of incendiaries as they could from further south. So I'm sure that there were airplanes that had the guns stripped from them to reduce the weight so that they could get a heavier bomb load in there. But they were from airplanes that were flying further south of us. We never had a mission aborted outgoing. All of our problems with the engines seemed to be very close to the target or on the way home. And after a long run, you can expect that. The engines will finally get a little tired and start to get hot and so forth. But no, it was interesting. I was asked that question one day about engines going down. And I was asked how many times we came home with all 4 engines running. And I looked in my logbook, and only 12 times did we have all 4 engines running when we got home. Often we came home on 3 engines, very often.
When you were coming home on 3 engines, could you come on 3 engines almost all the way from the target?
Yes. Yes, we could sustain that flight on this airplane very easily with 3 engines. Yeah. The bombs were gone, so the heavy part was over. So, yeah, we could maintain altitude and fly home very comfortably on 3 engines.
Did you always fill the fuel tanks completely full, or did you adjust that trying to just maximize bomb load and not necessarily fill them all the way up?
We did not always fill up the tank completely. There are a couple of reasons for that. Logistically, if you didn't need it, you didn't take it. But and we flew a lot of short missions where we would put 4,000 gallons aboard, something like that. But when we went to someplace like Tokyo, Yokohama area, 7,200 gallons was normal.
Did you ever take the additional tanks, the ones that are called Tokyo tanks, for a really long mission?
We never had to do that. For some reason, either I don't know if the other squadrons in our group did or not, but we never had to do that. If we were going on an extra long mission, which I would call 14 hours, something like that, we would take less of a bomb load. Yeah.
Did you ever land on Iwo Jima?
We were forced to land on Iwo Jima one time because we did have 2 engines go out, and while we could sustain flight on 2 engines, it was pretty risky. So as long as Iwo was available to us, we were north of Iwo at the time, and we landed on Iwo, and we had the engines repaired. Fortunately, nothing needed replacement. We just had the mechanics there repair the engine. It took most of a day, and then we flew on home from there. Yes, we did that twice, actually. Twice. 2 missions that were really incorporated in my mind forever. One was when we had to ditch because we ran out of fuel, And that was not done on the Mary Kay. That was done with a substitute airplane. And I'm giving that excuse because I was the one that calculated the fuel load. That was one of the engineer's jobs. And I calculated it based on the fuel consumption rate of my airplane. And the substitute airplane burned far more fuel. We didn't find out until we left. But I put on the load of fuel that I would have had for our airplane. Well, the ditching was a smashing success, so we remember that very fondly, okay? But the one that I hate, and I still have problems with it from time to time, was on the night of March 9th, when almost 500 airplanes left on a bombing mission with incendiary bombs to bomb out Yokohama and Tokyo. The first group that went in sort of flew in an X pattern so that they could mark the spot for us and keep us away from the Imperial Palace, which was taboo, by the way. We could not bomb the Imperial Palace. But they would mark the spot, and then all the rest of the airplanes would come in succession and use that marker to direct our bombing. The problem with us was the 497th, which is the bomb group that I belonged to. The 497th was the last group in. And we're flying at low altitude. We're actually flying about 8,000 feet on this mission. And the airplane was in gigantic turbulence from the fires that had already been lighted by previous groups. And so there was a lot of turbulence from that. We actually got up to about this attitude at one time. And the other thing was that we could smell the burning flesh of the innocent civilians. Well, maybe I shouldn't call them innocent, because we learned later that even women and children were sharpening sticks to fight us off if we had to invade. So I do feel sorry for them, very deeply sorry for them, but on the other hand, I believe it was warranted. So on the 6th of August, we were simply at home. We had already completed our 35 missions, and we were ready to be rotated home. That is my crew, okay? We were done. And so we were simply enjoying ourselves, playing volleyball and basketball, all that kinds of things that we were doing, just to kill time until we would be sent home. After all, the war was about to end, okay? We thought we were going to end the war with what we were doing, so the war was about to end. But on August 6th, we saw a lot of activity. We could see Tinian from Saipan. It's only a mile away across the water. So we could see lights on 24/7 over there. We knew something was going on over there. And although we didn't know what it was, and we didn't know any earlier than you did, really, that what happened. But yes, the Enola Gay took off on August 6th. We sat on our rumps and enjoyed ourselves because it was all over for us. So the fear was gone, and the delight in finally being able to go home someday soon was prominent in our hearts. Yeah. When we flew our last mission, we thought we were going home. 35 missions was all you had to fly. And we thought we were going home. But then the command put out a request for volunteers who would be willing to fly 3 more missions to resupply the prison camps, which were abandoned shortly after the second bomb was dropped the prison camps were vacated by the guards, and they left our prisoners there without potable water, without food. They didn't get much food anyway, but that was even taken away. Without any medicines that they required, the clothes that were on their backs and ragged blankets, etc., etc. And believe it or not, in Japan it gets cold. But anyway, everybody volunteered to go. Everybody. But our crew was one of the crews that was selected to go ahead and do it. I don't know by lottery or how, but they did it. So we then took our mattress covers. The first mission, we took our mattress covers, which were canvas bags about 4 by 7 feet long, and the guys on the ground loaded all of the supplies that they could get that we had available in terms of medicines and food and water, extra boots, jackets, whatever they could get, blankets, and all that sort of thing. Stuffed them into these bags. We put those in the bomb bay, and then we flew over the prison camps at about 50 feet or lower, and we were in ground effect, actually. Okay, we opened the bomb bay doors and shoved those bags out, and they bounced on roofs and on the pavement and so forth. But there was nothing in them to break anyway. So we did that 3 times, and therefore the total number of missions our crew flew were 38.
By that time, had the POWs marked the roofs or something so you could distinctly find those locations? How did you find the locations?
Well, the intelligence located them for us on maps.
Okay.
Yeah. And so even though a lot of the area around the prison camps were burned out and so forth and so on, the maps were able to direct us to the camps. And then, of course, when you got close to them, you saw what they were. Yeah. What I learned about, one of the things I learned about war is, number one, that it's kind of boring. You do a lot of waiting and a lot of preparation for a short period of time in combat, and then you wait for the next time. But the other thing about war is that I learned was that we don't really want to do this anymore. It's inhumane, actually. War is bad. Now, having said that, if we are again threatened by anybody, we're going to have to do it again. And if I were young enough, I would sign up to do it again. Because when it needs to be done, we have to do it. That's what I learned about war.